One of the most interesting claims Muslims make in every discussion is that the Quran is perfectly preserved through time. Not a single letter or a word has changed in the Quran since God revealed His word to His Prophet. The miracle of perfect preservation. But is that really true? This claim, when I investigated, I found that it contradicts all evidence found. The Quran was not preserved as claimed, and changes to the Quran is very evident in the past and even in the copies we have today. The claim that the Quran was preserved without change since the moment it was revealed to the present moment is simply a false claim and utterly untrue. Muslim apologists try to convince us today that the Quran was sent down in 7 different dialects or tongues to 7 of the Arabian tribes. And since then, it was transmitted perfectly to thousands of people, reciting the Quran word for word, memorizing it by heart. And since that moment, since that time, it was perfectly preserved and could not be changed. Even God Himself promised in the Quran, saying, "We have without a doubt sent down the message and will assuredly guard it from corruption. Inna anzalna dhikr wa inna lahu lahafidhun." But simple examination of Islamic history and Islamic tradition reveals how outlandish this claim of perfect preservation is. The first story from Islamic tradition itself that stands in conflict with this claim is the following story. Few years after Prophet Muhammad's death, we find one of the Sahaba, his name is Hudhayfa ibn al-Yamman, came to Uthman ibn Affan at the time when the people of Sham, that is modern day Syria, and the people of Iraq were waging war to conquer Armenia and Azerbaijan. According to tradition, Hudhayfa was petrified of how these people were different in reciting the Quran. He urged Uthman to reach out to these people and said, "Save this nation before their differences about the Quran go as far as Jews and Christians and how they differed about their books." Well, it is no secret that Islam and the Quran teaches that Jews and Christians have their books completely corrupt, and they, as nations, went completely astray from the original truth. That is what Islam teaches us about Christians and Jews. So for Hudhayfa to be so scared about the people in Iraq and Syria being so different in their recitation of the Quran can mean only one thing. They were so different and so far from the alleged perfect preservation of the Quran. And don't let anyone fool you, saying that these differences were just trivial or just differences in accents or dialects. Because in another version of the same story, and you will find the reference on the screen and in the description box, it says they differed in the Quran at the time of Uthman to the extent that the people and the teachers of the Quran started killing one another. حتى اقتتل الغلمان والمعلمون. This is the extent of how they differed. It is not my personal opinion. It is what Islamic history and traditions tell us. And then the original story continues. Uthman decides to do something about it. He cannot just ignore the situation like that. You may think if the Quran is perfectly preserved through the thousands of people who memorize the Quran by heart and know it word for word as they claim, it is very simple then. Surely Uthman and Hudhayfa themselves know the Quran word for word and memorized it by heart. Maybe it's as simple as let's gather a few more people who memorize the Quran by heart, sit together and have it written and distributed. Simple. But that is not what happened here. Hadith al-Bukhari tells us that Uthman sent a message to Hafsa bint Umar, one of Muhammad's wives, asking her for the manuscripts she has so they can compile perfect copies from the Quran from them. I thought people knew the Quran word for word and memorized it by heart, and it was transmitted to thousands of people. But no, we actually need to find what was written to make copies. Uthman then assigns the job to a man called Zayd ibn Thabit and 3 other men to help him and commands them, quote, "In case you disagree with Zayd ibn Thabit in any point of the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh. The Quran was revealed in their tongue." Wait a minute, my fellow Muslim. I thought you said that the Quran was revealed in 7 tongues. But here Uthman says that the Quran was revealed in the dialect of Quraysh. I also thought you said they knew the Quran word for word, memorized it, and recited it by heart. Perfect preservation. But here I see that they needed the manuscripts to copy from. And not only that, but the 4 most trusted men on the job may disagree with one another. Isn't that weird for a book that is perfectly preserved? The story then continues and says, Uthman sent to every Muslim province 1 copy of what they had copied and ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Hooray! Once again, a bit weird for such a perfectly preserved book. But, well, at least one may think the Quran now has been revised, canonized, and was passed on to us in written format, 1 Quran with 1 perfect dialect. But make no mistake, that is not what we have today. Bear with me and let me explain. You may think that if you go to an Islamic bookstore today to buy a Quran, you will buy exactly the same Quran from anywhere in the world. Isn't that right? Isn't that what you expect? Well, sorry to burst your bubble here, but even that is utterly untrue. It may only be true if you try to buy a modern English translation of the Quran. But in Arabic, it really depends where you buy your Quran from. Different parts of the world use different Qurans. Let me introduce you to a few different versions of the Arabic Quran that do exist today. Unfortunately, you wouldn't find these in English, and probably you didn't even hear about them. But here they are in Arabic. Mus'haf al-Shattibiyya by Ibn Kathir through Qanbal. Mus'haf Warsh, and this is the most popular copy today around the world. Mus'haf Khalaf through Hamza. Mus'haf Hisham ibn Ammar. Mus'haf Yaqub, or the Jacobian Mus'haf. Mus'haf al-Kasai. Mus'haf al-Asbahani. Mus'haf Abi Ja'far by Hafs through Asim. Mus'haf al-Tajweed. Mus'haf Abi Umar al-Basri. Mus'haf Layth ibn Khalid. Mus'haf al-Susi. Mus'haf Jammaz. Mus'haf al-Duri. Mus'haf ibn Wardan. And this is just to name a few. This is not by any means a complete list of the different mushafs or books of the Quran that are present today. Now the important question is, even if the Quran was revealed in 7 different tongues or dialects, the Islamic story tells us that they were all burnt but 1. What should remain for us today is Mus'haf Uthman, the one true canonized Mus'haf that Uthman and his team compiled. But this is not what you see in reality today. These different versions of the Quran reveal thousands of differences between them. But the problem doesn't even stop here, because we know for a fact that even those 15 copies that I mentioned, none of them is even a complete copy of the Quran. How do we know that? Once again, through Islamic history and Islamic traditions. There is a story about Ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph. This story tells us that Ibn Umar once heard some people bragging about receiving the entire Quran and reciting the complete Quran. He stops them and says, "Let no one of you say, I have learned the whole of the Quran. For how does he know what the whole of it is when much of it has disappeared? Let him rather say, I have learned what is extent thereof." But we also know from multiple other stories and sources that there are 2 chapters, 2 complete chapters of the Quran known as Surah Al-Hafd and Surah Al-Khula. They used to be in some of the oldest mushafs, but they no longer exist in the Quran we have today. And speaking of missing parts of the Quran, it is not only these two missing chapters that went missing, but also existing chapters today seem to have lost parts of it too. Take for example this story from Aisha, one of the Prophet's wives. Aisha tells us about Surah Al-Ahzab, one of the existing chapters today in the Quran, which consists of 73 verses. Originally, it was much longer. Aisha said, quote, Surah Al-Ahzab used to be recited in the time of the Prophet with 200 verses. But when Uthman wrote out the codices, he was unable to procure more of it than there is in it today. End quote. I don't want to make this video much longer, but the traditions and Islamic history tells us about missing parts of the Quran, missing passages, missing verses, missing entire chapters sometimes. It is telling us about people arguing, fighting, and even killing each other over differences between their versions of the Quran. We have evidence today with numerous different versions of the Quran existing today after allegedly preserving and canonizing one single version. How can anyone come after all that and claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved?